I'm Rebecca Braun and would like to welcome you all to Lancaster. It's fantastic to see so many people here. Many of you have been here before, and that's a real bonus to what we're about, but we're also welcoming new faces into the ongoing projects and research questions that we've been asking in the Authors in the World Hub. So I thought what I would do just for what is now 10 minutes would be to talk a little bit about the Hub and what we've done so far, but only really quite a little bit, and then open up this new area that we're looking at, world authorship, and explain how we've come to thinking about that and the kinds of things that we're hoping we're going to be hearing over the next couple of days, and I'm pretty sure that we will be hearing. So the Authors in the World Research Hub is a little bit does what it says on the tin. It thinks about how authors exist in the world. So it's looking at the real world context of literature, how literature gets out there, and the different sort of social circumstances that surround literature, and how all of this gets filtered through the person of the author. So one of our key ideas is that the author is like the human face of literature. And when you start to look at how authors are received, how they represent literature, how they play with that in their work, obviously, it's a really, really interesting and fruitful way of looking at much wider cultural phenomenon. So if you look at authorship, you find yourself looking at a whole host of interrelated cultural phenomena. We started off back in September looking at literary celebrity, which was our first research strand. And the reason that we chose literary celebrity is that it's one of the, well, obviously it raises these questions about the face of literature and how literature gets out there in the world and how it can mean different things in different contexts. It's also inherently interdisciplinary. If we're thinking about celebrity, you can't just do close textual analysis as literary studies tends to do. You've got to apply all sorts of different approaches to understanding the kind of cultural phenomena that we're talking about. So we've welcomed people from all of the different kind of major language areas that tend to get represented in higher education. We've had obviously English literature, creative writing. We've also had contributions from people working in film, from people working in cultural studies, historical perspectives on things, and more of a performance-led understanding of celebrity as well. So it's been a hugely rich seam that we've been what do you do with seams? Ploughing? Do you plough a seam? The seam that we've been uncovering as we've been developing our project. Now, one thing that's come out of it is that we thought about literary celebrity, and we thought, well, obviously that's going to be the world, because when you're a celebrity, you get famous, and then you kind of go global. And one of the interesting things that I think has become apparent is that literary celebrity is not necessarily about going global. It's actually quite sort of static. It belongs within a certain context. You're a celebrity in a certain context, and that often doesn't travel as well as you might think, particularly when you're talking about authors. They become very famous in one context, but they still remain not particularly well known in another. And it's certainly when it comes to how we study literary celebrity, we end up bringing it back to looking at specific case studies and a specific political construction within a specific political set of circumstances or economic set of circumstances. So that we had these wonderful interdisciplinary approaches to celebrity, but there wasn't much movement. We looked at a case in France, a case from Latin America, or a sort of a film studies take on something, or a remodeling through different genres. We had Mary Talbot talking about a comic or graphic novel sort of reincarnation of James Joyce, but it was always coming back to a specific local context. So obviously in a research hub called Authors in the World, we wanted to get some kind of movement into this. We want to see how authors travel. How do authors travel? And I'm obviously meaning not just physical people getting on planes, but ideas of authors and everything that an author can represent. How does that travel? And how do these questions of travel affect our ideas of authorship? And that really is how we came on to thinking about world authorship. It strikes me that these are quite important questions for us to be trying to address, because current models of world literature, which I started to look at when I was thinking, okay, travel, circulation, how am I going to make sense of this? my kind of major point of critique of the popular theorists of world literature at the moment is that they don't really seem to account for the human subject. It's this remarkably subject-less circulation that goes on. We hear about how texts circulate, and that kind of follows on from the intertextual moment, I suppose. We hear about how specific elements of language are or are not translatable. I'm thinking of Emily Apter's work, and obviously the text circulating and a mode of reading. I'm referencing David Damrosch. And Casanova talks about kind of, obviously she's building on a field theory approach to understanding this model of literature, and she talks about sort of political struggles between nations, but it all sort of seems to actually never really gets pinned down to people. So this is, in that context, I thought, well, world literature needs some understanding of a world author. How does literature have a face, and how does it move when you go beyond a local or a national context? So ideas of circulation obviously are part of a globalization discourse, and globalization has been a buzzword in all sorts of ways in the last kind of 10 to 15 years, whether it's a kind of a university policy that we must become more international and embrace the global context of higher education, or whether it's looking more at globalization as something that one can study. But actually, I think it's one of the big fallacies to say, well, now we live in a global world, that this is something that somehow the 21st or late 20th century has brought on. Obviously, you can go back and you can see elements of the global going way back. My husband is an early modern historian, and he always sort of undermines any ideas that anything might be new in the world. But when you're a Germanist, I shouldn't say Germanist in English, it sounds a bit odd. When you study German, everything tends to lead to Goethe. So we can go back to Goethe's Epoche der Weltliteratur, so epoch of world literature, which he kind of pronounced grandly in 1827. And I've put this up here because it's one of the first things that the Hub has actually produced, is some thinking about what world authorship might be. And we've come up with this is an edited special issue on the idea of world authorship, which just came out in May. And the second piece here, the actual first real piece, is by John Noyes. I wanted to draw your attention to it. You can't read the title because it's too small, so I'll read it out to you. Writing the dialectical structure of the modern subject, Goethe on world literature and world citizenship. Now, there's been quite a lot of research looking at the origins of world literature and tracing it to Goethe, and then saying, oh, Goethe didn't really invent it, actually. Herder had ideas about world literature, and he was growing on a number of thinkers who had come up with these ideas. But what was really interesting in John Noyes' article is the way that he says, well, world literature, what does Goethe actually mean by it? And he says that Goethe was responding to a form of globalization in coining the term world literature. And he wasn't saying, oh, it's all about, we're all global now, we're all exchanging our texts and we're all sort of in touch with each other, man. This wasn't what Goethe was about. That Goethe was actually responding to globalization and trying to find a space for literature that would allow him, if not to counter globalizing trends, at least it was in response to the political and economic developments that were taking people outside of a more national understanding of the world. So Noyes' point is that, as we've got the quote here, by bringing Goethe's feelings about globalization to the discussion of Weltliteratur, the idea of literature is weighted in favour of literary production. So these human subjects that I've been looking for, I've been trying to find somebody who talks about them in world literature, and oh look, it was Goethe. World literature must be understood in conjunction with world authorship. Now this is Noyes glossing on Goethe. I don't have time to do justice to the article, but if you read it, he does a wonderful, do come in, don't stand out in the hall, does a wonderful explanation as to the complexity of the terms. But for our purposes, the emphasis on the author and how it's looking at how literature is produced is an inherent sort of part of thinking about world literature. So following directly on from that quote, Noyes says, Weltliteratur articulates performances of subjectivity on the boundary between the local and the global. And I found that a really useful way of thinking about where is the world author positioned in respect of these sort of ideas of how literature relates to the wider world. Now, Noyes' point is that Goethe says, well, the author sort of performs his individual authorship within literature and explores this pull of, on the one hand, being part of something bigger, a sense of sort of a universal human subjecthood, but he keeps a sense of alterity, that we are all different, and that literature allows us to explore these universal ideas, but in our own specific individual ways. So his main point is that for Goethe, the world author is enacting that in literature, and therefore literature is an important, different kind of space to these homogenizing global or political or economic discourses. Now, so that makes the author into the exemplary subject, the individual author who's kind of battling against the pulls in different directions and trying to resolve it in literature, which I guess you can buy into that if you like, but from our real world context of literature it falls a little short, because you still come back to saying, well, okay, but how does that make sense in the wider world, and what about the fact that these authors start to become commodified? I've just come back from a wonderful conference in Munich called Writing the Market, and Anna-Katharina Krüger was one of the organisers of that, where we came to the conclusion that there's no way out of the market. So if you look at how authors fit into these kind of wider understandings of literature as a good, a commodity, and they start to be subject to rules of the market, and then this idealised literary space is kind of less ideal, I guess. So Goethe's model, in a way, Goethe exemplifies the failure of world literature, really to take on a real world manifestation, intersect with the real world. He raises the problematic location of the author, but I think that his sort of sidestepping into this idealised literary space is a little bit of a cop-out, perhaps. It doesn't really show us, it doesn't help us think through these wider questions of how literature relates to its wider global context. So it's quite nice to conclude that Goethe is a little bit insufficient. So moving forward massively, and I've come to Bruno Latour as a result of our November event, when Gary Hall, who was speaking, he was giving a cultural studies perspective on kind of the book as a commodity in itself, and how we might rethink books and publishing and academic publishing, and he shook us up in all sorts of ways in November. But from my point of view, one of the most useful things that's come out of it for me was that he introduced me to Bruno Latour, so a French sociologist, I suppose, who is pretty grumpy about what the social is, which seems a good starting point for a sociologist. And he's one of these kind of trending figures at the moment. I'm sure many of you have heard of him, but he was new to me. And to my mind, so his 2005 book, Reassembling the Social, offers a different way of thinking about circulation and how meaning is made, a different, a more socially grounded way into thinking about this location of creative agency. So, Goethe has this individual author struggling to be the exemplary citizen, as it were, whereas Latour thinks about agency and creative processes in a rather different way. So he has his own take on actor network theory. So thinking about how what the social is emerges out of relations between everything, really, right? And again, I'm glossing, and I can't do justice to Latour in the 2 minutes that I've allocated myself, but I'll just try and pick out what I've taken from him. So he thinks about how things relate to one another and how social context is created as a result. And bearing in mind, I'm thinking about world literature and how authors circulate around and there's some kind of meaning. This seems a useful way to go. So he talks about mediators. He says that mediators take a message or take an understanding of something and they mediate it and they turn it into something else. This is how we make meaning in the world. And the point about mediators is that they don't just sort of take a message from A to B, they leave a trace. So they always change the message as it goes. And maybe this will become more obvious if I give you a quote from Latour. He says, "Even though the question seems really odd at first, not to say in bad taste, whenever anyone speaks of a system, a global feature, a structure, a society, an empire, a world economy," he likes this, by the way, "an organization, the first ant to reflect should be to ask, in which building? in which bureau, through which corridor is it accessible, which colleagues has it been read to, how has it been compiled. So we're always focusing on, well, how does a sense of any system emerge? Well, it's through specific mediators who will affect whatever the message or the thing is that the system is creating. They'll affect it as it goes. And he makes the point that mediators can be people. So here we can see which colleagues has it been read to. People will have influenced the way, in our case literature I suppose, has been seen. How is it being compiled? That's the editor, it's the people behind the processes. But it can also be non-humans, that sort of concepts, buildings, institutions, in which building, which bureau, through which corridor, also form part of this system and also mediate and constantly change what it is that we're talking about. So, in the context of literature, what does that mean? Well, we've got this idea of the world author, which, I've just kind of thrown out there, but I'm sure I probably wasn't the first. Where is the world author? What is it? I think if you think about Latour's ideas that you've got to actually look for where the mediators are and how the mediators are changing what authorship is and what literature is. I've got a little diagram to try and make that more tangible. The world author is out there as an idea, just as some kind of transnational literary space is out there as an idea. But we're always looking at it in specific contexts. So we've got our globe here, that publishers exist in certain parts of the world. The rights department exists, and that will affect how an author is or how a piece of fiction travels. Academies will award prizes, for example. They will be representative buildings. The grandeur of academies will rub off on authors. That will influence the sense of which author is, more important than another, or, people's associations will be affected by those both human and non-human mediation of literature that is always going on in any understanding of world literature. So, I guess where we've got to so far in thinking about world authorship, and it's been a sub-discourse going throughout the last 3 events that we've run, is that there's this sort of element of collectivity about it. That Goethe had an individual subject who was trying to keep that tension between the local and the global, and trying to perform in some sort of exemplary way to resolve the problems. But when you use someone like Latour, you see there's a whole collective network there that might underpin world authorship. So it's a collective global venture, but it's always realised on a contingent local level by multiple actants, to use Latour's terminology. So the conference today is really about taking those ideas and running with them. And I think from the programme we can see that a lot of people's, everybody's papers intersects with these questions in one way or another, the local and the global context, the idea of circulation, the human input into things, and also the sort of the non-human mediation that goes on. So I think it's really useful to flag all of that up as thinking about world authorship. And the final question to ask of ourselves, in as much as we're an Authors in the World Hub, we're thinking about authorship and world authorship as one form, is how might all of this affect what we think of authorship to be? So it seems to me that when you start to take this more collective approach to world authorship, you can demythologise the author, that lone creative individual, but you don't have to kill him off. So you don't have to go down the Barthes and the Foucault line of saying it's all just discourse, or he's all sort of to do with power and institutions. You can still keep the subject visible. You can fully account for the market, so you don't have to bracket things off like Goethe did, because you can see quite clearly when you start to take in this whole collective network underpinning world authorship, you can see exactly what the market's doing. But you don't have to capitulate to it. You don't have to sort of say, well, authors are all sort of stuck in the market so they can't do anything about it. Because when you study the different actants or mediators, you find a way of actually asking more questions about that context. So it's still something that can be critiqued. As I think you'll probably get a sense now, therefore you can start to recalibrate the relations between the local and the global in the theoretical models of world literature that I was glossing a little, that it's not just that, you know, you go first you have authorship on a local level, and then it's on a global level. Instead, we're constantly looking at moving between how the global is realised in the local context. And in a way, this is my most important point, is that you don't get rid of the author, you don't lose the subject by having this collective network understanding. You actually find ways of researching the human face or faces of literature without sort of fetishizing one of them. So we don't have to have this romantic author genius, or in translation studies there's a move towards saying it's all about the translator. The translator is the real creative person. You don't have to fixate on one of them. But you don't lose the human either by relativizing it. So the last point, and then I shall finish, the last point is that you make industry processes and blind spots visible to practitioners. And I thought it was important to include this, because with the ethos of what we've been doing on the project so far has been that we're looking at all of this obviously from an academic perspective, bringing in lots of different disciplinary approaches, but we don't just want to keep it within the academy, so there's this sort of meta-critique of our own authorship going on as well, but we want to engage with the wider literary industry, and that's why at every event we've run so far we've had a significant emphasis on having input from people who've got that real world experience in different ways to the academic study of authorship. And it's about, so what we're doing is about finding things that will actually be useful to people who work with managing the global circulation of authors and literature. So that's really all I wanted to say by way of setting out what I think we're going to be talking about. We've got 4 longer papers, 2 today, 2 tomorrow, where I think you can see really clearly they're going to engage with the local and the global that I was talking about, and the idea of circulation going to be explored from various different perspectives. We've got then a series of shorter papers. That's an experiment to see if we can do short papers, where the idea is that they're just going to pick up 1 or 2 points and try and take our thoughts and develop them further. And of course we have a really exciting industry panel tomorrow morning as well, where we will be taking sort of the academic thinking we're doing about world authorship and putting it to people with a rather different kind of experience of the circulation of literature. So I would ask you to be thinking throughout today what kinds of questions and ideas you want to take into that frame, as well as the questions and ideas that we're developing for our own academic understanding of everything.